At exactly 2 a.m. my gate screamed open with a grinding metallic shriek that shattered the silence like a banshee. I bolted upright in bed, heart thumping, thinking maybe someone was trying to break in. My driveway gate was never supposed to open after 10 p.m. Not without my biometric code or the backup security override I personally embedded in the firmware I built from scratch. Still half asleep, I fumbled for my phone, flipped open the surveillance app, and watched live footage of my gate creaking wide open as if welcoming a ghost. Or worse, a trespasser. But there was no one in sight. The logs had been wiped clean. Not disabled. Not corrupted. Wiped. That's when the adrenaline kicked in. Someone had tampered with my gate. Not by cutting wires or brute force, but by hacking into the very brain of the system I engineered myself. Whoever it was didn't just break in, they thought they were smarter than me. That was their first mistake. The second was leaving a handwritten note zip-tied to the gate. For community access, use HOA Compliance Board. That's when I knew exactly who it was. Karen. My name is Alex Carter. I'm a cybersecurity consultant by profession and a firmware engineer by passion. I built my smart gate system 5 years ago, complete with multi-layer encryption, local data logging, and what I like to call my personal Trojan canary, an embedded function that silently logs every foreign access attempt and masks itself while doing so. I designed it for fun. I never imagined I'd need it to defend my own driveway from an HOA lunatic with a clipboard and a superiority complex. But here we were. Karen Thornton was the newly self-appointed acting vice president of Gate Aesthetics and Access, a title she invented after buying the biggest house 2 blocks down from mine. The catch? I don't live in the HOA zone. My house and the 2 properties around me are technically outside of it, grandfathered in long before the HOA was even formed. That didn't stop Karen. She had a vision, and apparently her vision included turning my private driveway into a shortcut to the park behind my house. Never mind the security risk. Never mind the fact that people could now walk feet away from my bedroom window at any hour. No, what mattered to Karen was that my closed gate looked too unwelcoming for the community vibe she was trying to cultivate. So she helped herself to my gate. At first light, I walked outside with my coffee, determined to see the damage in person. There it was, my sleek, black, laser-cut steel gate hanging half ajar like it had been left out in the wind. And taped to it with neon pink duct tape was the infamous Karen note. I looked up and saw her strutting down the sidewalk in her velour tracksuit, her little white dog zigzagging on a retractable leash like it had a mission of its own. She waved like nothing was wrong and chirped out a "Good morning, neighbor." I didn't respond. She walked right up to me like this was a normal Sunday chat. "I hope you don't mind," she said, voice syrupy with fake concern. "We had to fix your gate. It was malfunctioning." Malfunctioning. That word almost made me choke on my coffee. My gate ran smoother than any commercial system in the neighborhood. I'd personally updated its software just last week. I leaned against the gate and crossed my arms, trying to keep my tone calm. "You hacked my gate." Karen blinked in mock confusion. "Hacked? Oh no, honey. We just helped it comply. This whole area is part of the HOA now. We rezoned it." I stared at her. "You can't just rezone private property." She smiled sweetly. "Well, the board agreed it was for the greater good. You know, safer access to the park for children. We've had concerns from parents. Plus, your gate was always so closed." I couldn't believe it. This woman had the audacity to override a private gate system and thought she was doing the neighborhood a favor. And somehow she thought rezoning was as easy as putting up a fence and having a meeting with muffins. I didn't bother arguing right there. Arguing with Karen was like trying to reboot a toaster with Wi-Fi. Pointless and likely to cause more problems. What she didn't know was that while we were talking, I was already checking my encrypted firmware logs from my phone. My Trojan canary had done its job. Not only had it recorded the exact time of breach, it had captured the unique identifier of the external USB device used during the override. Whoever programmed the breach had bypassed the GUI layer of the system and injected custom code using an exploit that would only work if you had local access and administrative credentials. That wasn't some random teenager with a laptop. That was intentional access, by someone who'd done this kind of thing before or got very specific instructions. Later that afternoon, I reviewed my camera feed. My system captures multiple angles with IR vision at night, and I caught something even more interesting than I expected. At 12:43 a.m. the night before, Karen appeared on my screen in a hoodie, crouched in front of my gate control box with a flashlight clenched between her teeth and a USB stick in her hand. She wasn't alone. A man, probably someone she hired, was beside her holding open the panel door. She plugged in the drive, typed rapidly for 3 minutes, and then left. She was methodical, not just someone poking around randomly. Someone gave her a script. Or worse, she thought she'd written one. But the real surprise came when I decrypted the fallback logs stored in the secondary firmware. It had picked up a payload, a hidden script embedded in the USB injection that didn't just open the gate. It tried to call out to an external IP address. My gate had nearly become a live node in someone else's network. Whether she knew what she was doing or not, Karen had crossed a line far beyond HOA drama. This wasn't neighborhood politics anymore. This was illegal access of a private security system and a potential cybercrime. I sat back in my office chair and stared at the flashing terminal logs. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. I didn't just build the firmware. I built it to defend against people like her. And if she thought her little USB stunt was clever, she hadn't seen what happened when I decided to fight back. My gate was only the beginning. Next came the payload she didn't know was already set to trigger the moment she returned. Because this time, when Karen tried to override the system, the firmware would fight back, with her name, her device, her face, and a full digital footprint. And it would be glorious. The morning after discovering Karen's midnight sabotage, I decided it was time to take a deeper look at what exactly she and her mysterious tech sidekick had done. The gate's override script was smart, I'd give them that. It wasn't just a one-time brute force command. It was designed to maintain access, reroute security logs, and keep the gate open between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., giving the illusion that it was simply running on a new schedule. Even more audacious, they programmed it to bypass the manual lockout switch that I had built into the hardware casing, meaning they either studied my firmware or got very lucky. Either way, I wasn't taking chances anymore. I spent the rest of that morning with a USB debug tool in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other, digging through every layer of the code. When I reached the buried payload section, the metadata tags all pointed to a modified version of an open-source gate controller library, one I had contributed to online years ago. My own past work had been turned against me, but they had added sloppy patches and a few flags I didn't recognize. That's when I saw it. There was a secondary callout embedded in the script, something that looked like it was trying to ping a Wi-Fi mesh repeater. That was odd. My system doesn't use mesh, and no one in this neighborhood should have had that kind of setup, unless they were setting up multiple listening points. Suspicious, I walked the perimeter of my property. The hedges that ran along my backyard had been left untouched for weeks. But now I noticed a disturbance. Something had been shifted behind the rose bushes. I moved aside a few branches and found a small, weatherproofed black box wedged between the thorns and the fence. It had no label, no brand. Just a tiny blinking green light on the back. I unscrewed the top and found a portable Wi-Fi transmitter with an SD card inside. Karen wasn't just opening my gate, she was listening. Or someone was. I yanked the device out of the bush and pocketed it. As I moved back toward the house, I started scanning my lawn and roofline. It didn't take long before I spotted another similar device, this one tucked under the eave near my garage, cleverly disguised as a security motion sensor. Only I hadn't installed it. That made 2 hidden transmitters in less than an hour. This wasn't casual nosiness. This was coordinated. And considering the software was targeting my gate system, I had a hunch these devices had been planted to monitor and maybe intercept commands sent to it. That's how they'd spoofed my encryption check. They weren't smarter than me, they just cheated. That afternoon, I began collecting evidence. I used a portable RF scanner to sweep the rest of my property. I found 2 more hidden sensors, one behind my backyard grill and another half buried in mulch near the corner of my property line. I also noticed fresh footprints in the dirt, 2 different sizes. One matched Karen's boot prints from the previous night. The other was larger, possibly the man she brought along. I took photos of everything, bagged the transmitters in anti-static bags, and uploaded all my footage and code captures to a secured cloud vault. I wasn't ready to go to the police just yet. I wanted to understand the full scope of this breach first. So I dug deeper. That's when I stumbled across something called the Community Safety Technology Initiative buried in the HOA's public document. It had been quietly approved during the last board meeting, a meeting I hadn't been invited to because, according to Karen, I wasn't technically part of the HOA. The initiative allowed for the temporary installation of security technology in border zone properties for the safety of children and elderly residents. The language was vague, but it gave them legal cover to place temporary monitoring nodes on non-HOA property under the pretense of neighborhood watch. And there, in fine print, was Karen's name. Project Chair, Karen Thornton. She had signed the documents, coordinated the tech, and clearly designated my home as part of their surveillance experiment. The most infuriating part? The document claimed that the affected property owners had been notified in writing. I certainly hadn't. I checked my mail logs, my security footage, and even my email spam folder. Nothing. No letter, no warning. Just a gate hacked open in the middle of the night and a bunch of signal repeaters shoved into my hedges. I decided it was time to confront her, but not at her home. No, that would let her control the narrative. Instead, I waited for the monthly HOA community coffee hour that she organized every second Saturday. It was held on the clubhouse lawn, where Karen would usually prance around in a pastel sweater set, greeting people like she ran a country club. I showed up in jeans and a hoodie, carrying a folded binder under one arm and a neutral expression. As I approached the gathering crowd, I spotted Karen chatting with 2 older couples near the refreshment table. When she saw me, her smile faltered just slightly. "Alex," she said, syrupy as ever, "so glad you could join us." "I have a few things to share," I said, holding up the binder. "I think the board should see this." Before she could protest, I walked up to a nearby folding table, opened the binder, and began laying out photographs of the transmitters I'd found, the footprint comparisons, a copy of the software code extracted from my gate, and screenshots of the surveillance feed showing Karen and her tech helper in the act. By the time she realized what was happening, half a dozen residents were already peering over my shoulder. One of them, a retired civil engineer named Roger, pointed at the photo of the control box. "That's your property, right?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And here's the USB stick being plugged into my private system, without my consent. And here's the data script it tried to launch." Karen's face flushed red. She tried to regain composure. "It was for safety," she said sharply. "People need access to the park. And your gate was." "Mine," I interrupted. "Built by me. Programmed by me. And definitely not public property." A few residents murmured. Someone said, "Is that even legal?" Another added, "Wait, did she really plant those things in his yard?" Karen tried to pivot. She blamed a misunderstanding, said the board authorized a limited rollout of park access tools and misunderstood my boundary. But it was too late. People had seen the footage. They saw the proof. And what was worse for her? I hadn't made a single emotional argument. Everything was cold, technical, undeniable. That's when she got defensive. "Well, if you weren't so paranoid about your gate, maybe people wouldn't feel so excluded," she snapped. And just like that, the narrative shifted. I didn't have to say anything. The HOA members started whispering again, but this time with a different tone. Skepticism. Karen had overreached, and she'd done it in the worst possible way, by leaving a paper trail and acting like a savior while playing tech spy in the middle of the night. I gathered my papers calmly, nodded to the group, and walked away without another word. But as I left, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. And if she thought this little confrontation was the end of it, she had another thing coming. Because next time she tried anything, I'd have more than just video and signal data. I'd have her entire tech operation mapped, traced, and mirrored. And when she plugged in her little USB stick again, it wouldn't just backfire. 3 nights later, everything was in place. I had reprogrammed my gate with an embedded retaliation protocol disguised as a firmware patch. From the outside, the system would look fully functional, even inviting. The logs would appear empty. The security key responses would act normal. But underneath it all, I'd hardwired a silent trigger. The moment someone used an unauthorized device to connect to the system's main board again, my gate would activate a lockout sequence and quietly begin transferring every byte of data from that device to my remote server. The intrusion would also trigger cameras I'd strategically repositioned around the control box, all set to record in full HD with audio. Karen wouldn't know what hit her. All I had to do was wait. And based on her personality, I knew she couldn't leave it alone. At exactly 12:19 a.m., I got the alert. Motion detected near the driveway gate. The camera feed went live on my phone screen. There she was, hood up, phone flashlight beaming into the metal control panel, and beside her was the same guy from the last time. Taller, maybe early 40s, jeans and a windbreaker. He pulled open the small panel door while Karen inserted a new USB stick. She didn't seem nervous, more annoyed than anything. I guess she thought I had fixed the gate manually and that her first override script had been deleted. She was here to reinstall it. Only this time, the gate didn't respond with its usual whir. Instead, it beeped twice and the red indicator light began pulsing in a pattern I had intentionally made look like a malfunction. Karen leaned in, clearly confused. She started typing again on her connected laptop. That's when the internal system began copying the contents of her USB drive. Scripts, text files, even the Wi-Fi credentials she had saved for her own access points. All of it streamed to my private cloud in real time while I sipped a drink from my desk and watched everything unfold. I even saw the moment her helper said something like, "This isn't what it did last time," to which Karen just shook her head and muttered, "Stupid thing probably reverted." She had no idea. The moment she hit the enter key to reboot the firmware, my gate didn't just lock her out, it activated a playback protocol. A voice, synthetic and calm, echoed from a speaker I'd hidden behind the gate's outer column. "Unauthorized access detected. Your device ID and credentials have been recorded. Step away from the gate." Karen jumped like she'd been electrocuted. Her partner looked around, alarmed. They quickly yanked out the USB and slammed the panel door shut. Karen hissed something and they both fled down the sidewalk, disappearing into the shadows of the street. I leaned back in my chair and opened the incoming data packet logs. The USB stick she used wasn't empty. It contained not just the override script but several other folders labeled in plain English. Folder names like access routes, target properties, and worst offenders caught my attention immediately. Inside each folder were documents listing homes throughout the neighborhood. Next to each address were notes about which properties had refused to join the HOA, which ones had problematic fences, or had previously challenged fines. Each entry had comments next to it, apparently written by Karen. Things like needs monitoring, potential violation, and uncooperative owner. My name was at the top of the worst offenders list. Under it she had written, "Controls access gate. High risk. Influences others." It was disturbing. This wasn't just an HOA overstepping boundaries. Karen was orchestrating a digital intimidation campaign against homeowners who didn't fall in line. I kept digging and soon found screenshots from a mobile app with icons shaped like little houses. Each house had a rating: green for compliant, yellow for questionable, red for non-compliant. The app included live data tracking usage of gates, lights, and even doorbell cameras. That's when I realized this had gone far beyond a rogue HOA member fiddling with code. This was surveillance. Someone, either Karen or someone she partnered with, was building a neighborhood-wide monitoring network, possibly to pressure people into joining the HOA or to track those who resisted. I contacted Matt, an old friend of mine who worked with a regional cybercrime division. We'd collaborated on some white hat projects in the past. I sent him a condensed summary of what I'd found and asked if it crossed the line from HOA overreach to something legally actionable. Within minutes, he called me. After a stunned silence, he asked if I had full copies of the scripts and recordings. I did. He said what I had gathered suggested possible violations of privacy laws, unauthorized digital surveillance, and possibly unlawful entry. He agreed to have someone on his team start a quiet investigation. In the meantime, he suggested I do nothing that would tip Karen off. Let her think I was still unaware. That suited me perfectly. But I wasn't going to just sit and wait. I created a fake profile and uploaded a version of my story to Reddit, slightly altered to protect my identity. The thread was titled HOA Karen Hacked My Gate, Didn't Know I Designed the Firmware. I included photos of the USB, blurred screenshots of her app, and even audio from the night of the attempted override. Within 12 hours, the post exploded. Tech bloggers picked it up. Cybersecurity influencers started dissecting my firmware setup. Some even praised the trap I'd built as a perfect example of passive retaliation tech. Karen's voice in the audio recording became a meme. Reddit dubbed her Override Karen. The post hit the front page of the subreddit and made its way onto multiple YouTube breakdown channels by the end of the day. I sat back and watched the entire internet slowly start to dismantle her without even knowing who she was. Still, this wasn't about online validation. I wanted her stopped. The gate was just the beginning, and if she'd installed surveillance equipment on my property, it was highly likely she'd done the same to others. I drove around the neighborhood that evening with a scanner running. Sure enough, I picked up 3 identical transmission signals near houses I knew weren't HOA members. I jotted down the addresses and knocked on doors. At 2 of the homes, the residents had no idea any tech had been installed on or near their property. One elderly couple hadn't even noticed the strange black device hidden behind their flower bed. I showed them what it did and where I had found similar ones. They were shocked and angry. I advised them to report it and gave them my contact information. Karen's web of control wasn't just unethical, it was predatory. She had manipulated her role in the HOA to build a network she could use to punish, monitor, and eventually force residents into submission. But now she was exposed, even if she didn't know it yet. The gate, the USB, the transmitters, the app, it was all cataloged, time-stamped, and backed up across 4 encrypted servers. I had everything I needed, and more was still unfolding. The final nail would come when the investigators accessed the rest of her cloud storage. Karen had wanted control. She'd hacked, lied, and trespassed to get it. But she made one fatal mistake. She messed with the one person who could beat her at her own game. And now, the firmware she thought she had conquered had turned into her worst nightmare. By the time the 4th day rolled around after Karen's latest gate stunt, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Whispers of surveillance, secret devices, and Karen's creepy tech experiments were spreading like wildfire. But none of it compared to what was about to happen. I had deliberately kept quiet after the Reddit post went viral. I didn't comment. I didn't add details. I let the momentum build while quietly feeding information to Matt's cybercrime division. They now had everything: USB logs, firmware traces, recorded audio, wireless network identifiers, even metadata from Karen's surveillance folders. It was no longer just a story online. It was a case file with teeth. And Karen? She had no idea the walls were closing in. The next HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse. It was supposed to be routine, but by now, everyone had heard some version of the story. Most weren't sure who the victim was, but they'd all seen the viral screenshots, and they'd definitely heard Karen's panicked voice from the gate audio. I showed up late on purpose. The room was filled with folding chairs, awkward small talk, and that unmistakable HOA tension, but today it crackled with unease. Karen stood near the front, putting on her best act as if everything was normal. She smiled too wide, nodded too fast, wore a blazer a little too sharp for a community meeting. When she saw me walk in, her smile froze. For once, she didn't wave. The HOA president, a retired dentist named Bill Holloway, called the meeting to order. They began with their usual nonsense: budget updates, parking complaints, someone asking about repainting mailboxes. Then Karen cleared her throat, stood, and launched into a long, breathless speech about the unfortunate misinformation circulating online. She never said my name, but she hinted plenty. She called the viral thread a malicious misrepresentation of a community initiative. She claimed that the devices had been installed for safety. She mentioned pilot programs. She even tried to paint herself as a tech-forward visionary, dragging the neighborhood into the future. A few people nodded along, but most stayed quiet. Then I stood up. I didn't say a word at first. Just reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of manila folders. I handed one to each board member. They opened them and silence followed. Inside was a full technical report, timestamps of Karen's gate breach, images of the surveillance devices, metadata showing they pinged her home's Wi-Fi, and screenshots of her custom mobile interface. But the final page was what hit hardest: a list of properties tagged as non-compliant, with remarks written in Karen's own words like target, override needed, and watch closely. When the room collectively turned to look at her, Karen tried to laugh it off. "These could be fake," she said, voice wavering. "They're not," I said, stepping forward. "They're from the USB drive you plugged into my gate. The same one that was broadcasting to your Wi-Fi at 2:17 a.m. 3 nights ago. I have the access logs, device signatures, and real-time video footage. Would you like me to play the audio?" The silence was thunderous. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then one of the board members, a woman named Dana who ran a small business from home, looked directly at Karen and said, "You put one of those things on my porch, didn't you?" Karen tried to deny it, but the room was turning fast. Another resident said they'd found a strange black box in their garden. Another had security footage of someone sneaking near their shed. But the tipping point came when two men in plain clothes walked in through the side door and asked to speak with Karen. They showed her a document. She stiffened, then tried to regain composure. "Excuse me, this is a private meeting," she barked. One of the men calmly replied, "Ma'am, we're with the State Digital Crimes Task Force. You've been named in an ongoing investigation involving unauthorized surveillance, property trespass, and digital intrusion." The room went still. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She grabbed her purse and tried to walk past them, but they gently guided her to the side, speaking in low tones. She wasn't handcuffed, but she was very clearly being taken for questioning. Once she was out of the room, all hell broke loose. People stood up, talking over each other. Some were furious. Others were scared. Several demanded to know how deep this went. The HOA president looked like he'd just swallowed a stapler. I didn't say much. I just gave the board a flash drive with copies of the firmware logs and nodded. I didn't need to rub it in. Karen had done that to herself. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to suspend all community surveillance initiatives indefinitely. They promised to conduct a full audit of any devices installed around the neighborhood. Karen was officially suspended from the HOA pending investigation, and the board vowed to re-examine every policy she had pushed through in the past year. I knew it was mostly damage control. They were trying to avoid lawsuit. But at least they were scared now. That was a start. Later that evening, I got a message from Matt. He said Karen's devices had been taken in for analysis, and preliminary reports confirmed what I already knew. Each one was built with off-the-shelf parts, configured to listen in on local networks and capture smart device traffic. Technically, that included everything from cameras to thermostat. It was invasive, it was illegal, and it was deliberate. They were preparing charges. She wouldn't go to prison, probably, but the fines would be massive. And the civil lawsuits? Those were already brewing. I'd heard that the elderly couple I had helped had filed a notice of intent that very morning. I walked outside that night, took a deep breath, and stared at my gate. It stood there quietly, locked tight, sensors humming softly beneath its matte black surface. It had done its job. It had defended me better than any alarm system or HOA complaint ever could. I walked up to the control box and plugged in a new update. One last addition. A live notification system that would send me a ping if anyone even tried to open the panel without the proper fingerprint. Just in case someone else decided they wanted to be clever. The next day, a local news station showed up. They'd caught wind of the HOA scandal and wanted interviews. I declined. I wasn't interested in fame. What I cared about was something much simpler. Control over my own property, my own privacy, and the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and exact. Karen had come for my gate with a smug smile and a USB stick. But she forgot one simple truth. I built the firmware, and you can't override the system when the system already knows you're coming. As I sat back in my office, the Reddit thread still climbing in views, I opened a new project folder on my desktop. I labeled it Gate Protocol V2, because in a neighborhood where Karen existed, you never stopped building defenses. You just made them smarter. And this time they would be bulletproof. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting where Karen had been escorted out by investigators, the neighborhood had taken on an entirely different energy. The usual smugness that used to hang around the cul-de-sacs had dissolved into a mix of cautious politeness and stunned disbelief. Nobody wanted to be the next to get caught up in whatever mess Karen had cooked up, and for the first time in months, I could walk my property line without seeing someone from the HOA trying to measure my grass or peek through my gate. But despite the calm on the surface, I wasn't finished. Not yet. Karen had done more than hack a gate. She had attempted to build a private surveillance empire on the backs of people who just wanted to live in peace. And though she'd been publicly embarrassed and legally cornered, there was still one final thing left to do before I could consider this done for good. The fallout from the investigation had moved quickly. Matt kept me updated through encrypted messages. They had pulled data from the hidden devices found on several properties and confirmed they had been collecting traffic data from smart devices and even attempting to log wireless camera feeds through brute force attempts. The devices had no manufacturer ID, but all of them pointed back to a central access point registered under a temporary business entity Karen had set up 6 months earlier. The so-called Community Safety Technology Group, a company with no website, no employees, and only one active device registrant, Karen Thornton. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. She had been financing her scheme through HOA discretionary funds under vague project descriptions and had even submitted fake invoices to cover her hardware purchases. A tidy little cyber empire, funded by residents she was spying on. That discovery caused a second storm within the HOA. Board members were suddenly scrambling to distance themselves. Emails were leaked. Meeting minutes were reviewed. Apparently, some board members had raised concerns but had been ignored or talked over by Karen during past vote. A few tried to claim they'd been misled. Others just disappeared from meetings entirely. Dana, the board member who had spoken up during the confrontation, reached out to me privately. She thanked me for exposing the truth and quietly offered me a chance to speak at the next general meeting to address the whole community. I politely declined. I had no interest in becoming a neighborhood figurehead. I just wanted to live without someone thinking they had the right to monitor my life. But I did have one more message to send. One final move. So I spent a quiet Saturday building something I had never intended to build when I first installed my gate. I called it the Karen Protocol. It wasn't a weapon or a trap, not in the traditional sense. It was a public statement, embedded into the firmware of my gate, designed to go live once and only once, triggered by a very specific event. And that event came exactly 3 weeks after the first hack. Because Karen, in all her stubbornness, couldn't stay away. She had been radio silent since the investigation began. No contact. No online posts. Even her once daily HOA emails had ceased. But on that Saturday afternoon, I watched through my window as a black SUV rolled slowly down the road and came to a stop just outside my driveway. The windows were tinted. The engine idled. And then the passenger door opened. Out stepped Karen, dressed in a black coat and dark sunglasses, like she was starring in a low-budget spy film. She walked to my gate, looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then reached into her bag. I almost laughed. She was going to try it again. Maybe she thought I was gone. Maybe she believed the investigation had made me back off. Whatever the reason, she reached into the panel with a new USB stick. The moment the drive connected, my gate hummed to life. A series of red lights flashed across the top, and then a screen embedded in the column, hidden until now, flipped open and displayed a simple message. The screen read, "Unauthorized override attempt detected. System engaged." Beneath it, a timer began counting down from 5. Karen stepped back, clearly startled. At 0, the gate opened, not to let her in, but to reveal a mounted screen behind the iron bars. It lit up with a video compilation. Footage of her breaking into the panel weeks earlier. Her voice echoing in panic. Side-by-side shots of the surveillance devices hidden across the neighborhood. And finally, a clip from the HOA meeting where she had been served by the state task force. The entire video played in perfect clarity, while my security cameras captured her frozen in place, eyes wide, lips moving but no words forming. Behind her, neighbors began stepping outside. One by one, drawn by the sound and the sight of the screen. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed. Children, retirees, young couples. All of them watching Karen stand at the scene of her own downfall. She turned to leave but stumbled, then paused as she noticed the cameras installed above the gate were now angled directly at her, recording her every movement. She didn't say a word. Just backed away, got into the SUV, and drove off without ever looking back. I didn't bother following. I didn't need to. That was the last time she ever approached my property. In the weeks that followed, she formally resigned from the HOA. The board issued a public apology. A neighborhood vote led to new bylaws that banned unauthorized surveillance projects and made it mandatory to get resident approval for any community tech installation. The Community Safety Technology Initiative was dissolved entirely, and its budget reallocated to real neighborhood improvements, things like road maintenance and park lighting. Actual helpful things. As for me, I returned to my quiet routine. My gate stood stronger than ever. But more than that, it now represented something else. A boundary, not just of property, but of dignity, of respect. You don't get to bulldoze someone's privacy and walk away like it never happened. Not anymore. I had fought back, not with shouting or legal threats, but with precision, with patience, and with the tools Karen never saw coming. The firmware remains. And every time I update it, I smile a little. Because deep in the code, next to the security protocols and access logs, there's a single, hidden line of script. A message embedded where no one else will see it. A reminder of why I built this system the way I did. It reads, "For Karen, you never controlled the gate. The gate controlled you. And that's all it ever needed to do."